Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we discuss Scandinavian democratic socialism. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, representing the Danish People's Party from Denmark. Up first, we're pleased to welcome best-selling food and travel writer Michael Booth, author of The Almost Nearly Perfect People, Behind the Myth of Scandinavian Utopia. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bill. Good to talk to you.
Michael, I asked you on the program to share your personal observations about the narrative that Scandinavians have somehow perfected the arts of happy living and good governance. Denmark and Sweden are back in the news, held up by some presidential candidates as democratic socialist utopias. Before we get on to some of the challenges the Nordic countries are facing, let's examine Danish happiness, which is how you start your book. Denmark regularly ranks first in the world in self-reported happiness, followed closely by Finland, Norway, and Sweden. So how come they have the second highest consumption of antidepressants?
Yeah, that's a very interesting paradox, isn't it? I'm not sure the two things are connected, but firstly, that word happiness is the one I always take issue with. I don't think the Danes are happy in the American sense of the word. I think they're very content and satisfied. I think they have low expectations, and I think they're very good at making the most of what they have. So happiness, I think there may be a linguistic thing, a kind of cultural thing. You know, if you ask Japanese people, are you happy? It seems boastful to say you're happy. If you ask Americans and they say they're not happy, you almost feel like a failure. The Danes, I think they don't want to be a burden. If they say they're not happy, it's placing a burden on the other people. Plus, in the last few years, I think it's become a bit of a self-fulfilling branding exercise. The Danes are aware they're thought of as the happiest people in the world. So it's quite a nice reputation to have, isn't it?
And also, they seem to be pretty good tipplers as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and why do you think I live here? You know, they love it. Absolutely. The rest of Scandinavia, not so good on alcohol. The government is very controlling and has state monopolies of alcohol. But, you know, this is Carlsberg land, is Denmark. So every social interaction is kind of lubricated with alcohol.
Well, you know, speaking of that, the Danes rate themselves as being happy about their health, yet they have the highest cancer rates in the world, the lowest average lifespan of any Nordic country, and they do tend to go for the booze and cigarettes. What accounts for the gap between self-reported health and objective health statistics?
Well, I mean, I actually think the Danes are very good at denial. I know that sounds a bit of a rough thing to say. Denial isn't necessarily a bad thing. We're all in denial of something, right, Bill? You know, we're in denial of mortality. I'm in denial of my receding hairline. The Danes are kind of in denial of their bad health, but they stay happy. You know, this old saw about, you know, well, at least I've got my health. The Danes don't really have that. You're right. They have the highest cancer rates in the world. They're a pretty a slovenly bunch. I wouldn't say slovenly, but they like the cigarettes, they like their booze, they like their fatty pork, and they also eat more candy per capita than anyone else in the world. But maybe here lies the recipe for happiness.
Happiness also seems to come from not working so hard. Your book claims that Danes are rated just behind the Belgians as the world's laziest, working the fewest hours and taking very long vacations. Is it true that thanks to the generous unemployment, disability, and welfare policies, Denmark is the best place in the world to be laid off?
It has been called that. Those policies have changed quite dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. They've really had to tighten in the welfare state. But it is true. I mean, lazy, that's quite a pejorative term, Bill. I wouldn't call the Danes lazy. They are very productive when they're at their desks. But it is true they work fewer hours than just about any other OECD country. But the other side of that is, as an American, you'd be well aware, you know, life quality isn't so great when you're working late nights and weekends all the time. You know, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Well, what percent of the Danish working age population does absolutely no work whatsoever?
Oh, I don't have the percentage to hand. But, I mean, there are some interesting cases where people have managed to play the system for 10, 12, 15 years, being perfectly able to work, but not. But they've been highlighted in Denmark, and they've been kind of the catalyst for some changes in the last few years.
Yeah, your book did highlight some fairly surprising numbers of folks who didn't lift a finger to support themselves. Is there any resentment of people who live on the dole? Don't Danes pay the highest tax rates in the world?
Danes do indeed pay the highest tax rates in the world, but the weird thing, Bill, is there's very little public appetite, political appetite for reducing those taxes, and here's why. The vast majority of Danes get as much, if not more, than what they put in. And we're talking the middle class here. You know, it's a country of a middle class with a very small elite and a growing working class, low-skilled class, but still it's a large middle class. And these are people, ordinary working people on average incomes with kids, and they are very grateful for the free schools, the free universities. They're grateful for the free healthcare, or they work in the public sector. A large number of people work or receive benefits from the public sector. So, it would be like the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving if people wanted to reduce taxes and reduce the public sector, because everyone benefits.
Michael, you write that Danes are also famous for having the highest personal debt-to-income ratio of any country in the Western world, owing on average 300% of their annual income, which is 4 times the personal debt of Italians. They're not much of a saving nation either. What's that all about?
Well, again, I think it's about this safety net. They're not going to fall too far if things go badly wrong. It's true. I think it may be the downside of the high taxes. They still want their nice Audis. They want their winter breaks in Thailand. So they do it on the never. They do it on the credit cards. And it's true, they have high level of private debt. A lot of that is linked to their property. We had a property boom a few years ago, which was encouraged by a kind of laissez-faire government. So a lot of people invested property. The property prices went up, property prices crashed, people are in negative equity. So I think a lot of that debt is explained by that. But it's also they have a kind of rather carefree attitude towards money, and they're very, very adept at borrowing from as many sources as they can find. And the other downside of the high taxes is they have a huge black market here. And, many Danes, obviously not me, I would never pay for anything without, nothing under the table here. But, they'll slip some money to the electrician or the plumber or the builder, and it will go off the records, So there are 2 downsides, I think. There are ways around the high taxes.
How long have you lived in Denmark?
On and off for about 10 years. I escaped for a few years and lived in Paris for a while, but I came back because actually Denmark is the best country in the world, I think, for raising kids. It's just fantastic for children.
Well, you mentioned that Danish parents seem to give their children a tremendous amount of freedom to roam and take risks. I mean, compared to the stereotypical American helicopter parent. How does this square with a society in which the adults are bound by an extraordinary number of rules, regulations, and restrictive social norms?
Well, they're 2 completely different things. I think there's an innocence, in a sense, to Denmark. A lot of it reminds me of Britain in the 50s and 60s. Where people aren't kind of paranoid about the paedophile in the bushes. Like, the British media, for example, and probably American, is always playing up these threats because it sells newspapers. Denmark is not quite like that. And they assess the risks. They realize that children need to go and climb trees and swim in the sea in the winter and do all sorts of moderate risk things. Plus, they have the freedom to travel on great public transport. Crime is relatively low here. Public transport is great. There's extremely high level of trust in Denmark. It's according to some reports, they have the highest level of trust in the world. And there's this amazing social cohesion, which also comes partly from having a homogenous group of people, who think the same, do the same, But also, I think when you have a very equal society, that's another of the benefits.
Given it's such a great place to raise kids, what's going on with the plummeting birth rate across Scandinavia? Are these nearly perfect people in the process of selecting themselves out of the gene pool?
This is way out of my pay grade. I think that plummeting birth rate is happening across the Western world, isn't it?
The numbers are pretty ugly all across Europe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of that has to do with the emancipation of women in the workplace, women wanting careers. These are among the most gender equal societies in the world. All of the Scandinavian countries lead in gender equality. So I think that's maybe one downside of that. Although I'm calling you from Japan, and they have the similar problem here, and they have exactly the opposite in terms of gender equality. So who knows?
Probing the Danish culture to things that seem a little odd to Americans, what is the Danish law of jante? Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, jante law. Well, it's not an actual law, Bill. It stems from a book written in the 30s, and it's a list of kind of social norms in Scandinavia, how to behave in Scandinavia, which still apply quite widely, even in cosmopolitan areas. And there's things like, you should not think you're better than us. You should not think you can teach us anything. You should not laugh at us. It's about keeping people in their place, not having too many aspirations, or it's about reining in individualism, which is maybe something you guys over on your side of the Atlantic could take a look at.
It doesn't sound like Donald Trump would do very well there.
No, we're loving Donald Trump, I tell you.
Wrapping up the Happy Danes, what's this thing they call hygge? Hygge.
Yeah, it's a spirit of kind of coziness and conviviality. And, when the winters are long and cold and dark, it gets the Danes through those dark months. They light the fire, they open a bottle of red wine, They remember their summer holidays, and that's hygge. I mean, it exists in Germany, it exists in Holland, they even have words for it elsewhere in Europe, but the Danes are generally considered to be past masters of having a kind of convivial, cozy time.
Michael, let's move on to Sweden, a country I'm more familiar with, having worked for Ericsson back in the 1990s. Belying its reputation as a Nordic welfare state, Sweden's gone through some significant reforms, including tax and spending cuts and privatization of many services. And unlike the more carefree Danes or the oil-subsidized Norwegians, Swedish companies have done quite well in global competition. How would you characterize Sweden today?
Sweden is in a massive state of almost emergency flux. But that's really been instigated by the immigration crisis, the refugee crisis in Europe this year. The Swedes are questioning everything right now. The political arena is totally up in the air. But you're right, it has had a huge success with these big corporations in the past 10, 15 years. Things like IKEA, Volvo, not even so well-known companies, but just the Swedes make ball bearings really well, and these boring little grommets and bits and bobs, and they conquer the world without anyone really noticing. And they're also, should be said, very proficient arms manufacturers. But they've done this because they have this amazing kind of social consensus, right? So big companies, they rely on a lot of people moving in the same direction. They don't have much time for the Danish mentality, which is everyone thinks they have the best solution to everything and they're going to try it regardless of what the managing director wants. In Sweden, they ask everyone, the tea lady, if they're going to change the operating system on the computers, the tea lady has a vote kind of situation. So once they get everyone on board, the big corporations move in the right direction. I don't know if that was your experience at Ericsson.
Absolutely. It was a consensus-driven, spec-driven, everybody gets around the table and talks it out culture, although the Swedes seem to be very taciturn in nature. You noticed that in your book as well. What does this say about their national character?
Yeah, I mean, the further north you go, the less people speak. It seems to be the general rule. The jokey theory is it's just too damn cold to stop on the street and chat. So, the other interesting theory is this high and low context society theory, where everyone knows what everyone else is thinking. When they all are kind of homogenous and the same, it's a high context society. Words aren't so necessary. You can say a lot with a look or an intake of breath. You don't need to verbalize everything. You see this especially with the Finns, but also in Sweden. There's also the fear of appearing stupid. Sounds ridiculous. We all have that fear. But there's this word in Sweden called duktig, and it means kind of being smart and not smart, overly clever, but just competent, I guess. And the Swedes live in permanent fear of being exposed as not knowing what they're doing. So they prefer to keep their mouth shut. It's not a bad policy. Maybe I should have tried it a bit more in my career.
If I could share a story related to keeping your mouth shut. In the 6 years that I worked for Ericsson, first as an employee and then a consultant, I was never lied to by a Swede, not even once, which I found quite astounding. But I almost always suffered from the fact that they were not very forthcoming when it came to sharing information that might have spared me a lot of aggravation. I finally learned the magic question to pry information out of them, and that is, do you know anything about this that you think I need to know?
Yes.
And if you say that to a Swede, all of a sudden, boom, they crack open. Did you also find them to be unusually honest, but yet hiding things?
Well, they're very blunt. You're right. Scandinavians are very blunt. They don't beat about the bush, particularly Danes. Danes pride themselves on getting straight to the point. Swedes are a little bit more sophisticated, refined, diplomatic, and I think that's probably what you experience. But if you ask them their opinion, they'll give it to you straight. And that's kind of refreshing. I lived in France for some years, and you have to work very hard to get to the truth in France. In Britain, we're kind of burdened by this baroque system of manners and politeness and humor that kind of conceals the truth often. But in Scandinavia, if you want the truth, they'll happily give it to you.
I heard the word lagom a lot working with Swedes. What does it actually mean?
It's kind of a sense of moderation in all things, and it's supposed to, I don't believe it, but it's supposed to stem from Vikings sitting around a fire, passing around the horn of mead. And so you would just take lagom, just enough, and then you pass it on to the next person. And, you can see that still permeating Swedish society. It's a society of moderation from the political sphere to the social sphere. They don't enjoy conspicuous consumption so much. It's back to the Jantelov thing of not thinking you are anything special, not being too greedy, Bill,
I don't know much about me, but I certainly remember the aquavit. Toasting norms and rituals are an important part of Swedish hospitality. Did they ever make you sing Helan Gore?
Oh, yeah. I've sung a few of those songs, and I've had the hangovers afterwards. The Swedes, they have a love-love relationship with alcohol, but the state has stood in and said, let's control this a bit. So they have the state monopoly on alcohol. You can't get a drink on a Sunday, that kind of thing. But when they let rip, as they do often at their crayfish festivals, for example, in the summer, I went to Malmö for the world's biggest crayfish festival, which happens every August. And my God, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. They're standing on the tables, they're knocking back this 40% aquavit. It's quite something to behold, quite frightening actually seeing Swedes let rip. And the songs are very important. And if you don't know the words of the songs, you kind of feel a bit of an idiot.
Oh, we had to memorize them. They used to put up big plaques where we would learn the phonetic words. Michael, you indicated in your book that you often intentionally provoked Swedes with unorthodox behavior just to gauge their precise position on what you call the Scandinavian social autistic spectrum. Share some of those stories with us.
Well, I spent a day in Stockholm behaving as un-Swedishly as I possibly could. So this involved, in museums, drinking under no drinking signs, eating a bag of crisps loudly, crossing the road on a pedestrian crossing when it was a red light, and people tutted at me for that. I think the Swedes can sometimes seem a little robotic, a little bit Stepford Wives. There's a book written recently called "Is the Swede a Human?" And it's supposedly a rhetorical question, but it is a question I've asked myself sometimes when I've been among the Swedes. They do have this extraordinary social conformity, which I think Americans would find quite alarming, actually.
Despite many reforms, Sweden remains one of the most highly regulated societies in the world. Their labor laws make it almost impossible to fire anyone, and union leaders are often guaranteed seats on corporate boards. And yet, unlike the French, Swedish entrepreneurs seem to be doing fine, particularly in fields like software. How do you account for that?
Yeah, again, America prides itself on being this high-risk nation of Donald Trumps, right? But in truth, when you have this great safety net, you're not so afraid to take risks. So, Sweden has given us Skype and Spotify and other amazing kind of software and technical innovations have come from all around the region. And these countries are also ranked among the best for doing business because of the freedom. In France, for example, where I've lived, if you want to do a deal, you get lawyers involved and there's lots of contracts and you just assume everyone's going to cheat you. In Scandinavia, they don't need so many lawyers. They don't need so many contracts because there's, again, this amazing level of trust. And one great example of where that bore fruit for Denmark was the wind turbine industry in the 70s, where these companies were growing up and they were sharing their innovations, sharing their research with each other. And Denmark ended up having one of the world's leading wind turbine industries. And the same thing I think you can see in Sweden.
Swedes often describe themselves as xenophobic, yet Sweden seems to be the leading Nordic pioneer of multiculturalism, welcoming more immigrants than any other Scandinavian country. You mentioned earlier that this is bubbling up into some troubles. Bring us up to date on how this experiment is playing out.
Well, it's playing out very badly. Sweden's had an open door policy for particularly Syrian immigrants in the last 5 years. They're suddenly realizing they can't really handle the numbers of non-Western immigrants. Going into Copenhagen on the train every day, I was seeing carriages full of Syrians and Somalis coming through Denmark to get to Sweden. Sweden realized this is not going to be sustainable. A couple of months ago, they put a block on the bridge between Denmark and Sweden. So those immigrants started to build up in Denmark. Denmark put up a block on the German border in turn, so now they're building up in Germany. It's a domino effect really caused by the Swedes because they welcomed and they were on their high horse morally. We're the great humanist nation. Come all you Syrians who need help and whatever. The Syrians came, the Swedes said, oops. It was a bit like, when a teenager puts out a party on Facebook and suddenly 10,000 people turn up and destroy the house. Swedes are having to deal with that right now. And they've created a problem for Denmark. They've created a problem for a lot of Europe, actually. We're not getting that many apologies from Sweden. But, you've seen the rise of the right-wing political party there, quite an ugly party with its roots in neo-Nazism back in the 80s. And Sweden is really going into a major period of introspection, I think, right now.
Scandinavia leads the world in gender equality, and it's probably fair to say the Muslim world lags pretty far behind. How is that clash going to be resolved?
Well, the positive me says that as Muslims integrate into Scandinavia and see how great the society is and how free they can be, they will adapt. And that is the case in many cases. I think the sheer numbers right now are a problem. And this is an unusual scenario kind of caused by the West, you could argue. So we have to take responsibility for it. But that doesn't help integrate 25,000 people into a country of 5 million people. it's a problem. I don't think there's a simple answer, Bill.
If you look at the hopeful side, how do second and third generation children of immigrants who came in the past fare when it comes to assimilation into Scandinavia?
Well, tellingly, the girls are doing much better than the boys. I think the girls see this amazing chance for emancipation, freedom, education. And in school, as I understand it, the children of immigrants, the females, are doing extremely well. The boys, on the other hand, that's the problem. And that's where you're seeing this kind of radicalization happening in some of the cities in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Denmark. And from that, we had an appalling gun attack last Valentine's Day last year in Copenhagen. There have been attempts in Sweden as well. It's a problem that's not going to go away. There's a huge disaffected Muslim male population who feel unwanted and second-rate citizens and are persecuted, but also bringing their own problems. It's almost, I think, an intractable problem, unfortunately.
So, Michael, sum up all the pluses and minuses for us Americans. What lessons does Scandinavia have for us?
Well, in many ways, your friend Bernie Sanders is right. America badly needs a dose of economic equality. Your country is out of kilter badly. And I think that's the fundamental lesson that Scandinavian has for the whole world, actually. Economic and gender equality. Now, whether you can bear to achieve that through redistribution of taxes is another matter. But it's an ideal worth shooting for, because from economic equality comes everything is better. Lower crime, happier people, things function better. If you look at the classic example is South Africa. If you're living as a rich person in South Africa, you live a life behind barbed wire, looking out at poverty. In Scandinavia, we don't have that much barbed wire. We have an equal society in which everyone benefits. That's the biggest lesson, I think, from the world.
Well, Michael, your book of stories was a delight. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and please keep in touch.
You're so welcome, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
There's one view behind the myth of Scandinavian Utopia from travel writer Michael Booth here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. Ahead, we'll speak with Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, about the turmoil engulfing Europe's social democracies. Stay tuned.